Hello and welcome to Performance Tested Comfort Systems PTCS heat pump sizing. If we do size heat pumps correctly, we'll increase the comfort and save energy and make happy customers. Benefits of the HVAC design process. Well, they don't happen by themselves, so we have to do some planning. Basically, if we get the right size heat pump, homeowners will experience greater levels of comfort. The unit will cycle less, which is easier on the compressor. Lots of lower auxiliary heat loss, and that's a good thing. When that auxiliary heat comes on, that's when the meter really starts to spin. Fewer customer complaints, fewer go backs to the home on our own time. Lots of rules of thumbs exist out there on sizing. One of the famous ones is 1 ton per 400 square feet. And if that was ever right, it was not on today's homes. It was probably in a house with single pane metal windows, maybe R11 in the attic, nothing in the walls, nothing in the floor, and probably a really leaky house. Other folks like the size using the 1 CFM per square foot of house. Hopefully later on today we'll talk about sort of sizing by square footage is not such a good idea. Other funny ones out there: tonnage, half the number of cylinders in the customer's biggest car or truck. What's in the shop today, and bigger is better, so we at least have to have a half ton bigger than our neighbor. And of course, everyone's probably seen this little comic to the right where you stand on the curb across the street and see what outline of the house covers the house. Heat loss, heat gain analysis, that's the first step in sizing a heat pump. You first have to know what the heat loss and heat gain happens to be. ACA, for many of you who have probably taken these classes, outlines this procedure in great detail. Manual J, by the way, which stands for Joule, calculates the heat loss and heat gain of a house. Manual S, where the S stands for selection, that tells you or gives you instructions. And I said, based on the heating and cooling load and your climate, what's the best system to pick? And Manual D gives duct design. And the reason we even mention Manual D is when we run into systems with low airflow, it's generally the ductwork that's the culprit. Correct sizing implies correct airflow. If you are going to size right, you have to install right. If we look at this graph right here, we can see that at full airflow, we have 100% of the capacity of this particular system. As we get, say, 20%, we're down to 90% capacity. Boy, if we get 30% low airflow, we're around 85%. So if you're going to size right, you have to install right. Size right, you have to install right. We all kind of got funny pictures like this around the shop, but that adage is very true. So when it comes to doing a heating load or a cooling load, it's sort of that old Greek formula. You need the square footage, the R and the U values, you need the duct multiplier, and quite honestly, the duct multiplier is a bit of a guess. We'll give you some guidance on how to pick it. And ACH, or how leaky or tight the house is, ACH standing for air changes per hour. We go through the selection process, and when you're putting a furnace in, they come in big BTU increments, 40, 60, 80, 100, and so on. We don't have to be super precise. There's an old saying in the heat loss business, it's horseshoes, hand grenades, and heat loss. Close really does count. Gets a little more complicated on cooling. All of a sudden we got put up with solar coming in through the windows. So we still have to collect the square footages, the U values. Windows are critical. We need the U value, the solar heat gain coefficient, and the orientation. East and west windows affecting the cooling load the most, because in the summer that's when the sun is low and just comes beating through those east and west facing glass. Duct multiplier, it changes from winter, especially if you have ductwork up in the attic. Internal gains, that's the stuff people plug into their house, like TVs, refrigerators, freezers, and it's also us humans. And then again on the ACH business. With heat pumps, we have to be a little more precise because the incremental size goes from 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 to 3 to 3.5. So rather than 20,000 BTU increments, we're now using 6,000 BTU increments. So being just a little more precise can go a long way. A word about those duct multipliers. Yeah, this house is funny, and you can say, hey, don't worry. We got a nice big return. and it's coming through the front door and back in through a window. And we can say, well, that's a dumb thing to do, but quite honestly, in the summertime, this house would have a lower duct multiplier than if it was in the attic. And like most people in this call today probably know, attics get really hot in the summertime. Um, Duct multipliers typically range from 10 to 30%. If the ducts are inside the house, 0 is a good number, but boy, if they're in attic and crawl spaces. But as good as you can do is a very tight duct system with at least R8 insulation. 20% starts to go up there. And honestly, if you're using 30% duct multipliers or 40% duct multipliers, you really should fix the ducts before moving on. So what this chart here shows is the square feet of attic at various R values needed to create 1 ton of heating load. That's 12,000 BTUs in Boise, Idaho. We can see that, boy, at R0 attic, it only takes about 500 square feet to create 12,000 BTUs of heat loss. R11, 2,500. And by the time you get to R38, you need 7,500 square feet of attic to create 1 ton of heating load in Boise, Idaho. So yeah, it's not the square feet, it's the heat loss. And this is another way of looking at the same information. This is BTUs through a 2,000 square foot of attic with various R values in Boise. Boy, you can see that R0, gas furnace this to handle the heat loss through the attic. By the time you get any insulation in the house at all, it starts to decrease rapidly. And by the time we get down to an R38, it's only about 3,500 BTUs of heat loss. Let's get some definitions out of the way. So we all talk about design temperature. What does it mean? Well, it's not the coldest or hottest day of the year. That's for sure. If we did that, we'd grossly oversize our equipment. Winter design conditions, you can find them for 1% or 2.5%. What that means, it only gets colder than that given temperature, say at 1% of the hours in the winter time. For Boise, the average coldest temperature is -2. That's referred to as the mean extreme. Winter design is 9 degrees. That gives you quite a bit of leeway. Summer, let's face it, I don't care what the design temp is, I want it cool now. Portland has an interesting climate. Its winter design temperature is 23, and the summer design temperature is 86. And if anybody here sells air conditioners in Portland, I bet they don't use an 86-degree design temperature. We'll revisit that to see if that's a good idea. When we refer to a heating or cooling load, really what we're referring to is how many BTUs need to be removed or added to the house to maintain indoor comfort at design conditions. Typical homes have heat loss rates between 20,000 BTUs and 80,000, and cooling loads between 12,000 and 40,000. Of course, a lot of homes will fall outside of that range. So when it comes to actually sizing the equipment, again, it assumes that we've done our heat loss and heat gain calculations. Most of the time, we get to relax. So when we say equipment sizing, what do we mean by that? It's sort of like the dating game. You're looking for the most compatible system to meet the house. And it is. It's finding the best match between the loads of the house and that particular piece of equipment. What the customer wants, well, we all know what they want. They want to be warm in winter and they want to be cool in summer. And it's our job to provide that. When is equipment sizing really important? Furnaces, they have to be big enough to heat the house. New construction loads are usually below 20,000 BTUs. Smallest gas furnace we typically put in is around 40. So it's oversized by a factor of 2. I don't hear a lot of problems when this happens. So I think relax. Air conditioning, because we live west of the Rockies, it means that we're lucky enough not to have high humidity during the summertime months. What that does, it allows us to focus on the sensible capacity of the air conditioner and not the latent capacity, latent referring to the ability of the system to remove water vapor and from the house. Heat pumps, they get a little more complicated. They have to be big enough to heat the house down to 30. We call that 30 degree the balance point. Time to sweat the details a little bit. And we have to spend a little more time on picking that heat pump. Furnaces, ACA says that we should not exceed 140% of the heat load of the house. That's really hard to do with new pieces of equipment in new homes. Typically, we're oversized by a factor of 2. It's probably not the biggest problem. By the time you start the oversizing by a factor of 3 or 4, it can certainly become a problem. Furnace sizing, it's relatively easy. All we're trying to do is to find the right size of the furnace for the heat loss of the house. Say we had a heat loss of the house at 45,000 BTUs. What furnace would be the right size? Well, this one, even on high speed, would be on our high fire would be around 40K. That's too low. We're not going to do that. This one would give us 60K on high and roughly 40K on low. Sounds to me like a really good fit. About what's the right size for a house with 36,000 BTUs per hour. We go down here, this one we focus on the output, not the input. 36, I don't know, we'd have to have everything just perfect. My guess is most of you would choose the next size larger, which is fine. What makes sizing for heat pumps different from furnaces? Furnaces, they maintain their output regardless of the outdoor temperature. Most heat pumps, the capacity of the heat pump change with outdoor temperature. The colder it is, the smaller the capacity. This chart indicates what we said on the previous slide. And here we have an 80K, 80% gas furnace. And sure enough, whether it's 47 degrees or 35 degrees outside, the capacity is the same. Let's look at a 3-ton heat pump. At 47 degrees, one of the AHRI rating points, sure enough, you get your 3 tons of heating. But by the time we get down to 35, we're actually closer to a 2-ton equipment. We also have to take into account the capacity of the heat pump at various outdoor temperatures for sizing. Goal of installing heat pumps in the PTCS program is to keep the electric strip heat off. Let's just say we install a 3-ton heat pump with all the fans running. That heat pump's going to draw about 3 kW. Say we put in 15 kW worth of backup heat. As soon as that backup heat came on, it'd be 15 kW plus the 3 kW from the compressor and the fans. Boom, we got 18 kW worth of heat going onto that house. You basically increase the draw by a factor of 6. And that's when the meter starts to spin and the bills start to go up. The goal really is to minimize the amount of strip heat or auxiliary heat that the system has to use to maintain comfort in the house. This is a very detailed capacity output chart for a particular manufacturer. Some of you probably recognize. This is going to be their 2.5-ton system, and the 2 AHRI rating points, 47 and 30. We can see that it gives you 28K at 47 and about 19K at 30. To size right, you really do need the detailed capacity tables from the manufacturer. This is a single-stage compressor capacity chart. And we can see it's pretty much linear. The warmer it is outside, the greater the capacity of the system. There's this little knee here, often referred to as the defrost knee, because when the system is in defrost, obviously the capacity per hour goes down. This is a very traditional capacity curve. Now with inverter-driven systems and cold climate systems, we can see the lines aren't quite the same anymore. This particular system, and it's a carrier system, its peak capacity is at roughly 25 degrees, which is a pretty nice fit. And you can see it's actually got greater capacity at 25 than it does at 52. And that makes sense. Our houses don't need to have the full capacity of the heat pump running when it's warm outside. And then we have that typical sort of capacity decline, but rather than starting, at 60 degrees, it starts around 25 degrees and goes down. This is another extended capacity or cold climate heat pump. You've got this nice flat performance curve between 47 and roughly 32. And in the Northwest, we spend a lot of our hours in that temperature range. Keeping that strip heat off. Well, we have to have controls, and we also have to have the ability to heat the house using the compressor only down to 30 degrees. Balance point. We often hear the term balance point, and it's simply defined as the lowest outdoor temperature for which the output of the heat pump can heat the house by using the compressor only. Below that temperature, the strip heat is going to be needed to heat the house. If it's a gas backed up heat pump, usually it's economic considerations, price of gas versus the price of electricity, etc. Um, Usually it's down to 40 degrees. So this is sort of an old school heat pump balance chart. The first thing that you do is that you do the heat loss calculation for the house, and you draw a line down to 65 degrees. And sure enough, the warmer it is outside, the less BTUs we have to pump into the house to maintain comfort. Let's plot our 2.5-ton system. So there's our capacity. We've simply drawn a line between capacity at 17 degrees and the capacity at 47 degrees. In this case, that 2.5-ton system would have a balance point of roughly 37 degrees. Too high for our wants. Let's see what a 3-ton comes in. 3-ton comes nicely in at 33 degrees. Let's see what a 3.5 will give us. 3.5 down to 28. That would make it a really good choice for the PTCS program. Sure, we could go larger, we could go 4 tons, but you know, it's going to cost more money. It might not add that much economic benefit, and the ducts probably aren't big enough to handle that much air. Another way of looking at heat pump sizing is just to recognize that if our goal is to have a balance point of 30 degrees, we really don't care about design temperature. We could actually do the heat loss of the house at 30 degrees, no matter where you are, in Port Angeles or Pocatello. It's still 30 degrees outside. So our house is going to have this heat loss at 30 degrees, and it's going to have a heat loss at about 30,000 BTUs at 30 degrees. Well, there's our 80K furnace, easily handles it. Probably a little too big to tell you the truth. Our 5-ton system easily covers it. Our 4-ton system covers it. 3.5-ton system nails it perfectly. 3-ton, ooh, that auxiliary heat is really going to run. And by the time we get down to 2 and 2.5-ton systems, we can realize that we'll have lots of hours where the auxiliary heat is having to be used to keep the house warm. We hear a lot, why do we care so much about a balance point of 30? Why don't we make it 40 degrees? What this chart does here is it breaks the temperature in Boise, Idaho into 5-degree temperature bins. So this one right here is 40 to 45, this one is 45 to 49. What's really interesting is that there are 1,553 hours between 30 and 40 degrees in Boise every winter. That's equivalent to 65 days. So you'd be telling your customers, if you had a balance point of 40 rather than 30, that you're going to have to use your auxiliary heat 65 full days more than if you had a 30-degree balance point. Let's see what it says for Seattle. Seattle, as we all know, is a much warmer climate than Boise, but there are still 930 hours, and that's the equivalent of 39 days. So that's one of the reasons the program really pushes for that lower 30-degree balance point, because so many places in the Northwest spend a lot of hours between 30 and 40 degrees every winter. Northwest heat pump sizing, boy, we kind of get a break. We don't have humid climates. So if we oversize technically a little bit on the cooling side, we're not going to have too many comfort complaints to high indoor humidity. The good news is that in the Northwest, most of the time we have a heating dominated climate and not a cooling dominated climate, and it makes more sense to design for winter performance than it does summer performance. If you're really into reading ACA manuals, Manual S says, boy, if you don't live in a humid place and you're in a heating dominated climate, you can use economic considerations. And there's been a lot of research done in the Northwest to prove that those economic considerations point to a target balance point of 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Which design temperature do you want to use? I have seen heat loss calculations turned in with using the wrong city. The most important thing you do is have to pick the right city. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to pick Portland, Oregon. And we'll take a look here at cooling. We see that the 1% cooling design temperature is 86 degrees. The 2% is only 83 degrees. If we go up here to the mean extreme, it's actually 99 degrees. The 0.4 is 90. Portland, Oregon has an unusual climate. Sure enough, only 1% of the time, historically speaking, has the summer design temperature been above 86. But your customers buy air conditioning for when it gets warm. And generally we see temperatures when people really use air conditioning around 95 degrees. My advice is don't be afraid of using the 0.4 cooling design temperature summer or the mean extreme. Now we have the official summer climate map of America. Down in the southeast, it's really hot and really humid. Your air conditioner down there really earns its title as being an air conditioner, because not only is it lowering the temperature of the air, but it's bringing all that humidity out of the air. Up in the northwest, it's not quite so hot, but it's still pretty muggy. Down in the southwest, it's just blazing hot. Rocky Mountain West, hot and really dry. And up here in the northwest, we sometimes get hot. Compared to the rest of the country, we're still pretty mild, but we do get hot, and air conditioning is becoming more and more popular, especially as we run into the 5th season, which is the smoke season. People are reluctant to open their windows and will rely on mechanical cooling systems. The good news is when we do get hot, we get dry. All we have to worry about is the sensible capacity of the air conditioner and not the latent capacity. Some more definitions. The total cooling load is a combination of both the sensible and latent. Sensible is that part of the cooling load that involves lowering the dry bulb temperature. Dry bulb temperature is just a regular thermometer. The latent cooling load, that's the hidden cooling load, if you will, it's a part of the cooling load that involves removing water vapor. The more water vapor you have to remove, the less the sensible capacity is. Some psychrometric definitions. Dry bulb temperature, that's the temperature measured by an ordinary room thermometer. It's also what the thermostat reads. This is sort of an old school non-digital psychrometer. You've got two thermometers in here, if you will. You have a dry bulb one and you have a wet bulb one. And there's a little cotton sock here and a water reservoir here. The sock wicks up the water and gets a wet cotton sock. And what the user of it would do would be to spin it around, and as you spin it around, water evaporates off that wet cotton sock. The drier it is, the more evaporation occurs, the lower that wet bulb will be. The wetter it is, the opposite occurs. So here in the Northwest, we often talk about having an ideal temperature split of 20 degrees. And sure enough, if we have a wet bulb of 62 degrees, which is common, and a indoor entering dry bulb of 76 degrees, 20 degrees is a pretty good target. But that's to say, some days we get out there and it's kind of muggy, and it's actually 68 degree entering wet bulb, and we have a 72 entering dry bulb. Our sensible split would only be 13 degrees. What's happening here is it takes quite a bit of, you're releasing quite a bit of energy when you turn all that water vapor back into liquid, and that lowers your sensible capacity. But Manual S says about cooling: don't oversize by more than 115% or 125% if it's a heat pump. We don't have to worry about that oversizing of air conditioner too much. Of course you can oversize air conditioners, but the reason they're so worried about that is dehumidification. And when we are 95 degrees, chances are that air conditioner is running a long time. It's not very humid outside, and as that air conditioner runs, it even dries the indoor air out more and more. So there's the nerdiest slide of today's presentation. It's called the C sub D, or coefficient of degradation. Newer heat pumps have a much lower coefficient of degradation. What that is the penalty you pay for short cycling. Newer systems, the penalty for short cycling, at least from an energy perspective, is not all that high. Manual says, what Manual S says about cooling: don't oversize by more than 115%. Why? I know I'm driving this point home because they're very concerned about dehumidification. Sizing for air conditioning. Okay, so we've got our load. Now we have to figure out what is going to be our best air conditioner to match the load of the house. Unfortunately, every manufacturer does these detailed capacity tables just a little bit different, making our lives complicated. But all of them tend to have at least this information, and the basic project is to find the outside design temperature. In this case, we're going to pick 95 degrees. That's pretty realistic. Determine your CFM. We're going to use 1200 because this is a PTCS job and we know we're going to get the correct airflow. So what that means, if you don't have 1200 CFM, if you only have 1000 CFM, these charts are wrong. Pick the lowest entering wet bulb, or EWB, if you will. Indoor wet bulb right here. 59, that's a good one for us. And then locate the sensible capacity. Here we have the total capacity, and again, that's the sensible plus the latent. And here, our 3-ton machine is giving us 30K with the sensible capacity, which is really good. Please notice if we pick 67, the sensible capacity drops all the way down to 20, but the total capacity goes up to 37. I really urge you when sizing your air conditioners in the Northwest to pick the lowest indoor wet bulb you can. That's the best indication of the sensible capacity, that ability to lower the dry bulb temperature in the house. Manual S cooling, understand those two loads are separate. Again, what's interesting is in other parts of the country, if you have a leaky house, the latent load increases because of all the humidity outside. In dry climates like ours, that leaky home, actually the air is so dry that the leakiness actually dries it out further. There are 4 important things to remember when sizing for cooling. Again, once again, we live in the great Northwest where we don't have to worry about dehumidification. That's the good news. Air conditioning originally meant you have to reduce the latent load and the sensible load. And insulation of the house and good windows and good ductwork are probably the biggest factors that are going to influence the size of the heat pump that you put in. And I'm sorry, nobody likes to look at detailed capacity tables, but to pick the right system, especially for cooling, you really have to look at them. In summary, these are the items you sort of have to sweat the details a little bit on. Insulation levels, don't worry if it's an R33 or an R38. Doesn't matter that much, but none, some, or a fair amount sure matters in the ultimate size of the heat pump you put in the house. House tightness here in the Northwest, it typically ranges from 1/3 of an ACH up to 0.8. New construction is probably going to be closer to 0.2. If your software tells you have an ACH of 2, something is probably wrong. That would be a barn with the doors open on a windy day. Windows, our solar heat gain coefficient is absolutely critical. In the Northwest, if you know the U value, that say you have a U value of your window of 0.4, the solar heat gain coefficient is also pretty close to 0.4. A lot of software out there guesses a little too high at the solar heat gain coefficient, which pads the cooling load a little too much. Duct multiplier, typically between 5 and 20%. If it's worse than that, you really should fix it. It's hard to make people comfortable with heat pumps with leaky, uninsulated ducts. And insulation is just as important on that ductwork as making sure the air doesn't leak out of it. House size is often important, but as we said, R values and U values and ACH and duct leakage probably have a bigger role, but obviously the larger house, all the other things being equal, will require a larger system. Capacity of the heat pump, the desired balance point, we're using a 30-degree balance point. And again, you have to look at the detailed capacity tables provided by the manufacturer. And oh yeah, number 7, make sure you pick the right weather station. Well, thank you for listening to today's presentation, and this signifies the end.